Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations on getting this book out.
Yes, it was a labor of love. It was great fun writing.
Eqbal was an extraordinary character. He was quietly charismatic, but incredibly engaging and analytical. I was wondering, in the course of your research, what came up that really surprised you?
About 1,000 things. I first met Iqbal in 1958. We were graduate students together at Princeton, and we were in a class on Arabic with the author of the text we were using, where 3 people sat. After 3 weeks, one of them dropped out. So Iqbal and I were alone facing this formidable professor, and we had to meet the professor at 8 a.m. every day for 2 hours. So we used to stay up until 3 in the morning every evening preparing for the 8 o'clock class. And at the beginning, Iqbal, who was very smart, he already knew Urdu, he knew Farsi or Persian, and of course English, and he was totally lost. Arabic is a challenge. It's not as difficult as Chinese and Ottoman Turkish, but it's close. And this young man who was lost didn't know what to do, but he had a poetic memory, the most uncanny kind. He would read a poem and on the spot memorize it, and then recite it and translate it. It was extraordinary. So he went to the library, fished around, and found a poem summarizing Arabic grammar. And he memorized it right on the spot. He came running into my room with his hands up, screaming out, "I got it, I got it!" I said, "What'd you get?" He said, "I found a poem that summarizes the grammar. I know what we're doing." And from that point on, he sailed through Arabic. It was unbelievable. Surprises. You think you know somebody. We shared an apartment at Princeton, and when you're roommates with people, you know their toilet habits, you know their cooking habits, you know so many things about them. What I didn't realize when I began the project, that Iqbal had a crystal ball in his head. And he saw things in international relations that nobody else saw. I knew he was smart because we had these incredible conversations with lots of people around us. But I didn't realize until I began writing the book how he really understood the future. And he did that through very hard work, which made the world seem as if it was effortless. He read everything. He took notes, which he hid away when he needed them. And what shocked me in reading his corpus, which is scattered all over the place, and it took a lot of work pulling them together. He gave me many of his articles, so that helped, but I had to do a lot of work to see what his thought process was. And that shocked me more than anything else, to see how right on he was on so many issues that nobody else got. I'll give you a couple of examples. He interviewed Osama bin Laden in the mid-'80s, when bin Laden was an American ally. And he concluded after the interview that this man would become a formidable enemy of the United States. And he based this on the tribal character that he saw in bin Laden. And we studied tribes. We knew what they were all about. We knew the revenge factors that come in when you desert them. And the U.S. deserted bin Laden after the Russians left Afghanistan. And on the basis of piecing together what he knew of cultural history, he was able to predict that this man would be the greatest enemy of the United States before anybody ever imagined this could happen. In addition, he went with his best friend, Edward Said, to visit Yasser Arafat in Lebanon. This was in 1980. And one of the most amazing things about Iqbal is that he was totally fearless and spoke his mind and didn't care where the chips fell. Didn't matter. And he approached Arafat after having toured the Palestinian military camps. And he told Arafat straight out, you could never defeat Israel using conventional arms. You're wasting your time. Arafat didn't know what to do. He froze. And Iqbal said, what you need is a massive nonviolent campaign following in the footsteps of Gandhi, with whom, as a child, he spent several months on a children's march. So he knew Gandhi well. He said, what we have to organize is millions of Palestinians who cross over the border in order to take back their homes in a nonviolent way. The violence will come from the other side, but not from the Palestinians. Arafat froze. He thought he was crazy, Iqbal. Well, today, the Palestinians, at least some of them, are moving in the direction of nonviolence and adopting some of the ideas that Iqbal put forward. Very cogently. He died in 1999. This was 1980. It took a long time for people to digest what he was arguing. I could go on, but at each level, he was completely original. On terrorism, you wrote this book of interviews with him. It was totally original. He understood that after the Cold War, the United States needed a new reason for being, a raison d'être. And that was going to be anti-terrorism. And he dissected the concept of terrorism in a way that nobody had done before, and nobody has done after. And it was brilliant. And your book of interviews, a slim little volume, says more than most other treatises by the best scholars in security affairs.
Now you say he was deeply rooted in Muslim culture.
Yes.
How did that play out?
His toilet habits. Number one, it's not in the book, but it was hysterical. If I didn't get into the bathroom before Iqbal, when we shared an apartment, I would get constipation for the day. It was important to be in at 7 o'clock before he got up. And then I learned that his mother, who was a great lady, would spend a full day in the toilet and would never come out, just prepping herself, not every day, once a week, in their home in India, in Bihar. And then I put the two together and understood that what I was up against was a cultural phenomenon. That when you do your toilet, you spend your time. You don't rush. He didn't care that I was waiting online. It didn't make a difference. So that was one cultural phenomenon that I didn't talk about in the book. But it was something that marked his rootedness in a culture that nobody ever talks about. Who talks about toilet habits when you're writing a book? It just is uncouth. But it's more than that. On his deathbed, his best friends and daughter surrounded him. He always had a coterie of people who surrounded him, because he was quite something. And one of the people there, the wife of one of his closest friends in the world, took out a copy of the Quran and started reciting surahs, chapters. His nephew, who is a strict secularist and is anti-religion,
This is Pervez
Hudbi, who's brilliant and wonderful, and Iqbal loved, turned to Iqbal and said, "Iqbal, can I stop her? This is nonsense." And Iqbal, about ready to die, turned to him and said, "Pervez, I'm a Muslim. Let her go on." He was surrounded by the best Muslim culture in his family house in Bihar. His grandfather had collected the best manuscripts and had the most extensive collection of manuscripts in the province where they lived. It was later turned over to Punjab University as a major collection. And the father inherited those manuscripts and read most of them. It was amazing. He was a landlord. Most landlords in India were uncultivated. There were exceptions, but most of them didn't know Muslim high culture. His father did, and he ran poetry contests in the home, giving out small prizes. They would have the best Muslim dancers of the region, the best musicians come in. They had art on the wall, miniatures that came out of the culture. They had the finest rugs imaginable, so that the culture permeated his growing up. And more than that, and this will be the conclusion for that question, if you really know Islam, you understand that the basic principle of the religion, which most Americans have no idea about, is a striving for social justice. And if you're a good Muslim, you do whatever you can to promote social justice. And my friend Iqbal internalized that. And throughout his life, he fought for social justice. And it marked him totally. And in that sense, he was a Muslim.
And it was that very point that he talked about at the University of Colorado at Boulder, the inner jihad, where one struggles against human frailties and greed and envy and those kinds of things. And
it was his best lecture that he ever gave in his life, and he was an orator. He gave great lectures, but that one in Boulder, I don't know what you people did, but you energized him. And it was an extraordinary lecture.
Well, he was also a child, if you will, of imperialism. He grew up in the British Raj.
Yes.
How did that have an impact on him, that direct contact with the empire? And then talk about what happens to his father.
It changed his life. He refused to go to a British university. Because of imperialism, he didn't like the British. In fact, he told me that when he was about 8 years old, he saw his first English man. And he was so petrified, he ran into a ditch to watch him from a distance. He decided to go to America because he refused to go to Oxford or Cambridge, where most intellectuals from the Indian subcontinent went. And that changed his life. He went to Princeton, where I was as well, which was terribly stodgy and very conservative, and it radicalized him. I think he's probably the major Princeton graduate who was a radical, and radical. So this hatred of the British led him to go to America, which transformed him totally from a narrow nationalist into a cosmopolitan intellectual who at one point looked like Marlon Brando. This is what he looked like when he came to Princeton.
Quite dashing. Unintentionally so, though.
No, intentionally.
Intentionally, you think?
Yes.
But he never cared about clothes.
Yes, but you don't know the inner person. This is myself and him in the snow of Princeton. He was a skinny Pakistani with betel nut stain red on his teeth. He went to a New Jersey dentist and had it cleaned off as soon as he could, because all the women sort of laughed at him in Princeton. He couldn't take that one. Now, getting back to your question. The British and Iqbal never got along. And he abhorred several things. One was colonialism, and therefore struggled against colonialism all of his life. The second was dictatorship. He hated dictators with passion. People come up to me and say, he was friends with Castro, wasn't he? And I said, impossible. No way. Castro came to New York. Iqbal did not go to see him. And he warned people in the third world, stay away from dictators. Oppose dictatorship. It's going to ruin our countries. And what he saw is that in post-colonial societies, the leaders of those societies grew up under colonialism. And therefore, they were going to be the same dictators as the colonialists. And he never trusted them. Never. And got into a lot of trouble because most of the people he confronted in the third world were dictators. I'll tell you one anecdote that is not in the book. I left a lot out because I concentrated on his ideas. And you have to leave a lot out if you want to do 200 pages, which people will be able to read quickly and turn the pages fast. In the early 1960s, after Algerian independence, which we both had studied profoundly, that is, the war plus what happened after, we both went to Algeria to attend a labor union conference. There's only one union in Algeria. And we sat there and watched something astounding. At the podium was the figurehead of the Algerian state. The real figure behind the state was the military general Houari Boumediene. This was Ahmed Ben Bella. Ben Bella was one of the 7 founders of the Algerian Revolution, and he survived the revolution because the French jailed him early, and therefore nobody killed him. And he came out of jail, and he allied himself with the military, which took over power after the revolution. As we're sitting there, we see the hall empty. It was filled. And we discovered that the men and women who were elected by the labor union members had all been arrested. All. And suddenly the hall fills up with peasants who were there to vote the government program. Iqbal became furious. He ran up to the podium, stared Ben Bella in the face, and remember, this was a military regime. They could make you disappear in seconds, if they so choose. And he screamed at Ben Bella, "You're betraying the revolution!" And he went on for 15 minutes. And I was sitting there waiting for them to arrest him. The guy was fearless. I've never seen anything like it. And this was only one out of at least 20 occasions where he did things that nobody would ever dare to do. He never thought of personal consequences. If something was wrong, he spoke out and he fought against it. And it was an incredible characteristic of his being, in effect.
Well, let's backtrack a little bit to the 1930s. His father is murdered.
1937, his father didn't have to practice law since he had a law degree, because he married a rich woman who brought a great deal of land and jewelry, gold jewelry, into the marriage. Since he didn't practice law, he decided he would defend exploited peasants in the province of India where peasant exploitation was the greatest. There was an Naxalite movement there that was a violent movement protecting peasant rights. And the jails were filled with these Naxalites. His father would interview the peasants who were exploited. If he could win a case, he took it, and usually won. If he couldn't win the case, he would turn over some of his wife's or his own land to the peasant for good, just gave it to them. Well, the landlords in Bihar hated him. I mean, he was defending the people they were exploiting. And one of them, including a close relative, hired peasants from the area using machete-like swords to enter the family compound at 3 a.m. with Iqbal sleeping next to his father. Iqbal woke up with the noise. The peasants are slashing his father. His father jumps on his son, covers him. 2 hours later, the father dies. Iqbal becomes catatonic as a result. It took him about 9 months to a year to regain his senses. What I attribute to this is his quirkiness. He internalized everything. And from that time on, began to see the world very different from anybody else. His mother was frightened that if she left her children, who were small, in the village, an Indian village which was isolated, they could be abducted. So she sent them off to live with the oldest brother in the family, who was more like the French revolutionary Robespierre than anyone else I could imagine, totally uncorruptible. He became the tax collector of Pakistan, the tax inspector of Pakistan, people tried to bribe him, they would be arrested. Iqbal got his inner force from his father, from his brother, and his mother. His mother was uneducated, illiterate. But she had absorbed high Muslim culture by listening and by memorization. It ran in the family. And she hated nationalism, hated it. When Pakistan was formed, she refused to move. She said, we don't need these divisions. We've lived together, Muslims and Hindus, for centuries. They're creating an artificial state. And she stayed in India. Now all these forces are operating on Iqbal. Then he goes to Forman Christian College.
In Lahore.
In Lahore. And he studies with a couple, excuse me?
1951?
51 to 57. And he meets some extraordinary professors, some of whom I've interviewed in Pakistan, who in turn introduced me to his student friends who had graduated with him. And one of the professors who was the curator of the Jinnah, president of Pakistan, important papers, said that Iqbal was the smartest student he ever had in his life. And I met one of his professors in New York later, a gentleman who was trained as a missionary but never preached. And he and his wife were extraordinary people, Americans. They had been in China until the Chinese Revolution, fled and came to Pakistan, and established a social psychology department at the university where Iqbal was, and Iqbal worked for him. And his morality rubbed off on Iqbal. He also went to Princeton, and he told stories of it, so Iqbal was induced to go to Princeton through him. And this man, and I met them, and I knew them well, were as moral and upright as you could be. So the forces that were converging on this guy came from several directions, all of whom were exemplars of extraordinary people who did extraordinary things.
Speaking of nationalism, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's Turkey was seen by many as a model state, but Iqbal had a very critical view of Atatürk and the state he created.
In the second year of Princeton, Iqbal, at dinner parties we attended of our professors and things that he would make himself. He was a great cook, gourmet chef. And one evening, he blurted out, and the consensus in the field of Middle East studies at that point was that Ataturk was a great man because he transformed Turkey from a backwards state to a modern one. Iqbal blurted out, Ataturk sucks. And everybody sitting at dinner sort of jumped up. These were all Middle East experts. And Bernard Lewis, who's now in his 90s, had written the book already on Turkey, which praised Ataturk to the moon. And here's this young snot-nose screaming out at dinner table, but Iqbal loved to do it. He loved to shock people. And he did it all the time, and it was so funny if you knew what he was doing. So after he did this, he starts giving a soliloquy on why Ataturk was bad. And his basic argument was that Ataturk used foreign ideology, which robbed the people of Turkey of their souls. He negated Islam, which you cannot do. It's the soul of the people. It's what makes them tick. I live in Morocco. I watch. Everybody is religious. You could count the atheists on your pinky. And if they are, they keep their mouth shut. They don't say anything. And he was way ahead of his time. He said that because Ataturk took away the soul of the people, there will be revenge. And the Islamists will come to haunt them in later years. And he said this in the 1950s before anybody ever dreamed that that would happen as it happened in Turkey. It was extraordinary. I'll never forget that dinner party. And the Orientalists sitting there astounded because Ataturk was their hero. He didn't care.
Imran Qureshi of Ottawa has asked me to ask you that Iqbal was always peering around the corner into the future and discerning what lay ahead. Imran wants to know from you, what informed his analytical power?
I wasn't especially impressed with him when he came into Princeton, because everybody around us was smart and special. There were only 500 men there. Today there are 4,500 to 5,000. It was a very elite school. Everybody was chosen. The cream of the cream were the physicists who were 19 years old from France, and they could do whatever they wanted. They were the most eccentric people in the world. And they would write 3.5 pages PhD theses, although all of us were struggling with 400 pages, 500 pages, trying to get it all done. And as soon as they finished their 3.5 pages, they were thrown out, all right? They got what they wanted from them. And that 3.5 pages shook the world of physics or mathematics or something like that. They were extraordinary people. So everybody around us was really smart. And we were freaks. We weren't Protestant. And if you weren't Protestant, the Protestants wouldn't talk to you those days. We had one Protestant friend in the 8 years we spent in Princeton. He turned out to be the son of the CIA director of all of Russia and Central Europe, who had killed too many people and committed suicide in 1965 because of it. So his son latched on to us to learn from us and to sort of feed off of us. What happened, and this is the beauty of a place like Princeton, you walk into a seminar and the teacher would give you a bibliography of 80 pages and would say to us, go home and read. In addition to having to write a paper a week for each course. Well, we learn how to read fast. Boy, did we learn how to read fast. You just go like this, and you learn to read the introduction, the conclusions, look at the index, look at the table of contents, and read the one part that you really know to see if the person is knowledgeable, if they really know what they're talking about. He had to do this. And we read until there was no tomorrow. And the library is beyond belief. They have everything. And Iqbal would sneak off, not tell anybody, and hole up in the library and read everything. The Islamic corpus, the Urdu newspapers, poetry, you name it. He was always there. And what was so beautiful, he made it seem so effortless. Never talked about it. Never. And he read everything. And then he went to those classrooms, and some of the teachers were pretty conservative. And they threw stuff at him that really gnawed him. He couldn't stand it. So Princeton, this most conservative place, radicalized Iqbal. Something else happened. And here I played a part. I don't play it up in the book because I'm writing my memoirs. It'll be in that. I took Iqbal to New York, where I grew up, quite frequently. Princeton was close. We would sit in the Figaro Cafe and listen to Allen Ginsberg scream howl. I took him to pocket-sized theaters. And theaters in those days were bursting at their seams. The country was totally conformist. And the one place that wasn't conformist was Greenwich Village, theater and poetry. And we saw stuff, Pirandello, Genet, Ionesco, turn the world upside down. And we knew there were alternative ways of seeing. And it gave us great hope, because the conformity was stifling. Stifling. And from that point on, Iqbal loved New York. He understood what it offered. He came back there as often as he could, and he got involved in its culture.
I remember visiting his apartment on the West Side.
Yes, of course. That was his salon. You've all heard of Bloomsbury, Virginia Woolf at the head of this. Virginia Woolf at the head of this incredible group of English intellectuals. Well, imagine being in New York City in the 1980s with Edward Said having a salon 10 blocks from Iqbal's, Iqbal having a salon, every important writer, journalist, political thinker, opposition figure wanted to meet Iqbal because he published throughout the world, and they read him. There was a line to eat at his table. Iqbal adopted me as his younger brother without telling me so. So I was allowed to come anytime I wanted. They would put an extra plate on. And the conversations were ping pong. They were scintillating. Because Iqbal couldn't stand gossip. Hated it. And the best minds in the world were there. And then next door were Edward's salon. And then I had a friend who I introduced to everybody, and we all became a group. An African-American woman who I grew up with, who died at 47 and lived 5 lives. She was a social pediatric specialist who founded the social pediatric division of Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx and shook up the shelter system in New York City by visiting them with subpoenas in her hand, and they would shake when she walked in. And she had benefits every night for causes that she catered. And they were all in the same neighborhood. And we went from one to the other. It was paradise. It was Bloomsbury on the Hudson.
What was her name?
Sandra Shepard. She's my 3rd biography.
Now talk about his relationship with Edward Said, because on the surface at least, you could hardly...
Let me read it.
Okay.
Because
on the surface at least, you could hardly imagine 2 more different characters, you know, from the shoes they wore to the, you know, the watches and the... Yes.
This is the best part of the book.
And I remember Said, while you're looking for that, mentioning that Iqbal was like Kipling's Kim, a friend to the world.
Yes.
They were very close.
They were brothers.
I remember when Iqbal moved to Islamabad, and I met with Edward, and he was kind of angry that he had left New York and moved to Pakistan and was rueing that.
Yes. I should have had it marked. I'm sorry, folks. Yeah. Iqbal met Edward for the first time in 1968. The U.S. war in Vietnam and the protests against it defined in those days America's intellectual and political environment on the political left. Iqbal, as a leader of the anti-war movement, had become a prominent figure. He surmised that Edward already knew about him even before they met, and that the critic would favor an outspoken dissenter who lived in the United States without becoming a citizen. It goes on. I'll ad-lib the rest. Thank you. It was wonderful to see them together. They loved each other and fed off of each other and laughed like you cannot imagine together. The best part of their relationship was their correspondence, which would make a most extraordinary book. They took as models medieval princes who would write the following letter. My dear brother, you are the moon, the stars, the brightest things in the universe. I love you so. By the way, I just captured your most important city in Afghanistan. I'm sure you'll understand and forgive. And we'll go on. Well, Edward and Iqbal adopted that style. And Iqbal would write, I am a tiny speck of dust under your stunning feet. I am, I'll use the English word, not the Urdu one. I am a spoon in comparison to your glory. And we'll go on like this. And when you read these things, you would drop dead laughing. They were so funny, and they had so much fun doing it, imitating the past, imitating all the nonsense of royalty and whatnot. And they played around a lot. If you went to Edward's for dinner, he had this uncanny knack of turning to a guest and drawing out the best first of all, you couldn't get in unless you were interesting. All right? So he knew that if he confronted somebody, it would be good. All right? You couldn't enter otherwise. And he would turn to you and he would draw you out and suddenly become a star. Well, anybody eating at a dinner table where you're a star, you go home beaming. And he did this to everybody at the table. It was extraordinary as a talent. I've given dinner parties, and I know how hard it is to draw people out and sort of make them very charming and wonderful. It's an art. And he had it. And it was wonderful. Iqbal would throw out these ideas that would drive everybody crazy. And then they would start reflecting. Holy Hannah, that was totally original. I got to think about it. I brought him to visit my family, working class people. This was a scream.
This is in Brooklyn?
No, this was in the Bronx. And we're sitting around the table, and he knows they're working class people, conservative. He throws out one sentence. There was silence. I love Ho Chi Minh. My family is over. Mao Zedong too. And then he starts talking about China. How wonderful China has it. He didn't believe it. But what he wanted to do was shake them up and start them thinking about their sacred cows. And he did this all the time. He was so much fun to be with because you never knew what the hell he was going to do. I leave all of this out of the book. And the reason I did was I concentrated on his ideas because they were totally, totally original. And I don't want them to be forgotten. I wanted this new generation to want to read him, to want to study what he did. And when he taught not only subject matter, he taught morality, and he mobilized his students to be activists, and they all became that. And I interviewed many of them. And his mark on them is extraordinary. Once you met him, you never forgot him.
He had innovative ideas about South Asia. He talked to me once about a possible federation, and he also had a unique approach to solving the Kashmir issue.
My own personal feeling, I think it was utopian.
The South Asia Federation?
I think everything about South Asia. He opposed partition after the fact. He participated in it. And that's a story in itself, and it's in the book. Could you imagine being a Pakistani and opposing partition? That's more than going against the grain. That's suicide. Because if you scratch most Pakistanis, they're supranationalists. I think if you scratch most people, they're supranationalists, with some rare exceptions. And he came up with this notion, ultimately, that partition was wrong. And after he separated from his wife in New York, he lived with an extraordinary Indian intellectual, Radha Kumar, who wrote a book about Pakistani partition. And when he was 15 years old, or 16, he went to fight in Kashmir. He just quit school. He didn't tell anybody where he was going. When he came back, his older brother beat the hell out of him. And he spent 4 months with the fighters in in Kashmir. And he was a champion of Kashmir independence. At the same time, at the end of his life, he thought the only way out was a federation between India and Pakistan, which, in my opinion, would go nowhere. There's too much nationalism in India, especially now under Modi, and too much nationalism in Pakistan to give up the prized possession of Kashmir. But he never thought that it was hopeless. He was a proverbial optimist, even at the worst of times. And we faced bad times together, bad times.
He was always generating new ideas, suggestions.
Look, I was afraid to go visit him sometimes because he would mobilize me, and I had a busy life. There was no way I could do what he asked. And he would give me 10 assignments. And I was running part of the anti-war movement. I didn't know whether I was coming or going. And with those 10 assignments, I was lucky if I could do 2 of them. So I would stay away, but I couldn't escape Bloomsbury on the Hudson. It was too exciting.
Ultimately, he was deeply influenced and wedded to what he called the Indo-Islamic culture, that unique culture, the blend of Islamic civilization with Hindu civilization.
His apartment was filled with carefully chosen, extraordinary rugs that he himself bought. He lined his walls with Indian, Persian, Turkish miniatures. He somehow got hold of Gandhara, Alexander the Great, sculptures and put them in his apartment. The culture of Islam filled his life, and the poetry. He would recite for hours. And I heard beauty, the likes of which I could never get exposure to otherwise. Because as he recited from the greatest Urdu poetry, and it is great poetry, unfortunately, Westerners don't know it at all, and then would simultaneously translate into English. And you would sit there mesmerized. And this would go on for hours. And it was so beautiful, you didn't mind. It was a treat. It was like being at great theater, seeing the best play. And I've seen the best plays in New York. This was equivalent.
There's that historic meeting of Edward Said, the great Urdu poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz, and Iqbal in Beirut at a time of civil war.
Faiz Ahmed Faiz is unknown in the West. He's among the 10 greatest poets who ever lived. And for me, he came alive. I'd never heard of him through Iqbal, because he was his favorite modern poet. And the images were so extraordinary and so subtle and so beautiful. And when Iqbal chanted them, you got the original Urdu rhythm, which made them come to life. They were, the rhythm alone, without the translation, was so extraordinary. So I discovered a new world. And boy, am I grateful for that. I never in a million years would have known that within Urdu literature are the gems of the 19th and 20th century.
The book is Eqbal Ahmad, Critical Outsider in a Turbulent Age, published by Columbia University Press. The author is Stuart Schaar. Thank you very much, Stuart.
Thanks for having me, David. It's a pleasure.
And just a local plug for Alternative Radio, which has one of the largest audio collections of Eqbal Ahmad, so that complements this extraordinary book.
Thank you. Thank you, David.